Story 1. Beeville, Texas, the haunted cemetery. Beeville, Texas, was the kind of small town where the most exciting thing on a Friday night was a late drive down empty roads, searching for something, anything, to break the monotony. It was during one of these restless nights that Jack, ever the thrill seeker, suggested they visit an old, supposedly haunted cemetery just outside town. They say weird stuff happens there, he grinned, flicking his cigarette out the car window. Figures in white robes, strange lights, people disappearing. Amy and the narrator exchanged glances. The stories were nothing new, but the thought of seeing something firsthand sent a nervous thrill through them. After some cajoling, the group, Jack, Amy, Lisa, and the narrator, piled into Jack's beat-up sedan and headed toward the cemetery. The drive felt longer than it should have. The dirt road leading to the cemetery was barely maintained, with deep grooves that made the car jolt and rattle. The further they drove, the more the world around them seemed to fall away into an eerie silence. No crickets, no wind through the trees. Even the usual hum of distant highway traffic was absent. It was as if they had crossed into a place where the world held its breath. Jack turned down the volume of the radio, the static crackling in the stillness. "Kinda weird, huh?" Amy hugged herself. "Maybe we should turn back." Jack scoffed but didn't argue. Still, he pressed on, the headlights barely cutting through the thick darkness ahead. The cemetery was smaller than expected, hidden behind an old, rusted gate. The hinges groaned as Jack pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As they stepped inside, an unexpected fog rolled over the gravestones, curling around their feet like ghostly fingers. It was mid-July, too hot for fog, too humid for this kind of chill. Lisa whispered, "This doesn't feel right." The group hesitated but continued forward, weaving between the old headstones, some cracked and leaning, others covered in moss. The sense of being watched pressed down on them, making their movements slow and cautious. Then Amy froze. "Guys, do you see that?" They followed her gaze to the far side of the cemetery, where 4 figures in white robes stood in a perfect circle around a particular grave. Their movements were synchronized, slow, deliberate, like some kind of ritual. No words, no sounds, just the eerie, coordinated swaying of their bodies. Lisa let out a strangled breath. "What the hell are they doing?" No one answered. The figures, oblivious to their presence, continued their silent performance. Then, as if sensing the group's gaze, one of them stopped and turned its head, directly at them. The others followed, their faces hidden beneath the hoods, but the weight of their attention was suffocating. "We need to go. Now," the narrator whispered, already backing away. Jack fumbled with his keys, hands shaking as he struggled to fit them into the ignition. Lisa whimpered. Amy was frozen in her seat, and the narrator couldn't stop staring into the fog, half expecting the figures to appear beside the car. Finally, the engine roared to life and Jack slammed on the gas. The cemetery disappeared into the rearview mirror, but just before the car turned the last bend, the narrator saw something. One of the figures, standing at the edge of the road, its pale, featureless face staring after them. No one spoke on the drive back. The silence stretched between them, heavier than before. No explanations, no rationalizations, just an experience that would never leave them. Jack never brought up the cemetery again, and none of them dared return. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything was too quiet, the narrator swore they could feel unseen eyes watching from the darkness. Story 2: The Highway Detour, a mysterious warning. The rain had been falling steadily for over an hour, turning the highway into a slick, glistening ribbon of asphalt stretching endlessly into the darkness. The windshield wipers of my SUV rhythmically thumped against the glass, barely keeping up with the sheets of rain. It was past midnight, and my 2 kids, Lily and Max, were restless in the back seat. We had been on the road for hours, heading home after visiting their grandparents, and exhaustion was setting in for all of us. Max, 8 years old and full of energy even at this late hour, was poking at his older sister, who swatted at him in irritation. Their bickering had started as a quiet annoyance but had quickly escalated into full-on yelling. "That's it," I muttered under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter. "We're pulling over." I spotted a gravel turnout on the side of the road and eased the car onto it, putting it in park. "Both of you settle down," I said, turning to look at them. "I need a minute of peace before we keep driving." As I sat there in the silence, rubbing my temple, a pair of headlights appeared in my side mirror. A car, an older model sedan with its high beams cutting through the rain, slowly pulled up alongside us. My stomach tightened instinctively. It was late and we were in the middle of nowhere. Who would stop here? The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man and woman, both pale and oddly still. The man, gaunt and angular, leaned slightly toward me. The woman, equally thin, stared straight ahead, her eyes vacant. "Hey there," the man said, his voice low but clear over the rain. "You might want to avoid going any further. There's been a bad crash up ahead." I sat up straighter, my grip tightening on the wheel. "A crash?" He nodded. "Yeah, looks bad. Road's blocked. But there's a back road you can take, quicker too." Something about them unsettled me. The way they barely moved. The way their clothes seemed damp and wrinkled as if they'd been sitting in the rain for hours. But more than that, it was their eyes. Dark, sunken, and void of emotion. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should take the shortcut." I swallowed, my instincts screaming at me. "I think I'll stick to the main road." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Suit yourself." The sedan's window rolled up, and without another word, they drove forward, disappearing into the rain. A creeping unease settled over me, but I shook it off and turned back to my kids. "Buckle up," I said, starting the car again. "We're almost home." As we continued down the highway, I expected to see flashing lights, wreckage, something, anything, to indicate an accident. But mile after mile passed, and there was nothing. No emergency vehicles, no twisted metal, not even skid marks on the wet pavement. Then I saw them again, standing perfectly still at the entrance of a side road, the same couple from before. They weren't in their car. They were just there watching, their faces expressionless, their bodies motionless despite the heavy downpour. A chill ran down my spine. How had they gotten here so fast? And why weren't they drenched? Their clothes looked just as damp as before, no more, no less. I hit the gas, my heart pounding. Something was very, very wrong. By the time I made it home, my nerves were frayed. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the strange encounter over and over. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined some of it. Maybe they had been trying to help. Maybe there really had been an accident that had already been cleared up. Maybe my exhaustion had made me paranoid. But something inside me wouldn't let it go. So later that afternoon, when the rain had stopped, I decided to go back. I told myself it was just to satisfy my curiosity. Maybe I'd find some skid marks, some shattered glass, proof that an accident had happened. Maybe I'd even see the couple again in the daylight and realize they were just normal people. But when I reached the spot where they had stood, my breath caught in my throat. The side road they had insisted I take ended just a few yards in. A massive wooden sign stood at the entrance, weathered and covered in creeping vines. Dead end. The road was impassable. Beyond the sign, thick trees and overgrown brush completely swallowed the narrow path. There was no way a car had gone through there, no way it could have been a shortcut. Cold dread pooled in my stomach. They had wanted me to take that road. They had insisted. But why? A gust of wind rustled the leaves, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard something. A whisper, barely audible, drifting from the dense woods beyond the sign. Should have taken the shortcut. I turned and left, speeding all the way home, never looking back. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept picturing their faces, the hollow look in their eyes, the way they had appeared so suddenly, the way they had been waiting for us at that side road, as if they knew we'd come. I checked the news. There had been no reported accidents on that highway, no roadblocks, no detours. Whatever they were, they hadn't been warning us. They had been trying to lead us somewhere, and I was terrified of finding out where. Story 3: The Oregon Highway, the Silent Stalker. The Oregon Highway was a lonely stretch of road at night, winding through endless pine forests, barely lit by the moon hanging low in the sky. The rain had started an hour ago. Not a heavy downpour, but a steady drizzle that turned the pavement slick. My gas light had flicked on 20 minutes earlier, a sharp pang of worry cutting through my exhaustion. I'd planned on stopping in the next town, but the signs had lied. There was nothing but darkness and trees for miles. The car sputtered before jerking forward, the engine coughing one last time before dying completely. I cursed under my breath and eased onto the shoulder, my heart sinking into my stomach. I was completely alone. I pulled my phone from the passenger seat, but there was no signal, no service, no Wi-Fi, just an empty set of bars mocking me. I exhaled sharply, locking the doors out of instinct. I would wait. Someone had to come by eventually. Minutes crawled by. The rain pattered against the windshield in an uneven rhythm, the wipers squeaking every time they passed over the glass. The silence outside the car was suffocating, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I checked my phone again. Nothing. I tapped the screen, as if that would force the bars to appear, but the device remained lifeless. The world beyond my headlights was nothing but shifting shadows, the road stretching in both directions like an abyss. I adjusted in my seat, trying to get comfortable, but the unease creeping up my spine wouldn't let me rest. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was my imagination. A flicker of movement between the trees, something long and slender stepping just out of view. I squinted into the darkness, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or the figure moved again. Tall, thin, too tall. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the lock button on the door, even though I knew it was already secured. The thing in the trees took another step forward, just enough for my headlights to catch its outline. No, that wasn't right. Its limbs were too long, its body stretched unnaturally, as if someone had pulled it apart and stitched it back together wrong. It stood still, head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were studying me. I didn't move, couldn't. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure didn't move either. We sat there, locked in a silent stare-off, the rain whispering against the car. A sudden, sharp tapping against the driver's side window made me jump. My head snapped to the side, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. There was nothing there. When I turned back, the figure was gone. The road ahead was empty, the trees unmoving. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. Lack of sleep, the stress of being stranded, it was getting to me. That had to be it. And then my headlights flickered. Just for a second, the light dimmed and surged back, and in that moment, I saw it again. Closer this time, much closer. I fumbled for the keys, turning them uselessly in the ignition, my fingers shaking. The car was dead. The gas light was still on, mocking me. I slammed my hand against the dashboard, sucking in a panicked breath. The figure took another step. I pressed back against the seat, as if that would somehow put more distance between me and it. The silhouette loomed just beyond the glow of my headlights, motionless, waiting. Then it started to move, not walking, gliding. Its feet didn't seem to touch the ground, its movements unnatural, like a marionette held by invisible strings. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to snap out of whatever nightmare I had fallen into. The tapping came again. I bit my lip, forcing myself to look. Nothing outside my window, but when I turned my gaze back to the road, it was right there, face inches from the glass, hollow eyes boring into mine. The mouth was wrong, stretched wide in something that was neither a smile nor a grimace, just an empty, gaping expression. My breath hitched, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A hand rose, long fingers, too many joints pressing against the glass. A streak of something dark smeared across the window where it touched. My body was frozen in terror, every instinct screaming at me to move, to run, to do something, and then the headlights of another car washed over the road. In an instant, the figure was gone. The approaching vehicle slowed as it reached me, the driver rolling down their window. "You all right?" I gasped for air, my hands still gripping the wheel as if I were afraid to let go. I turned to look, expecting to see the thing still lurking somewhere in the darkness. But the road was empty. The stranger leaned forward, peering at me with concern. "Hey, you okay? Need a ride?" I swallowed, my throat dry as I forced out, "My car. It ran out of gas." The driver nodded. "Come on, there's a station about 15 minutes up the road. I'll give you a lift." I hesitated, glancing back at the trees one last time. Nothing moved. Nothing watched. With shaky hands, I unlocked the door and stepped out into the night, leaving my car, and whatever had been waiting for me, behind.